Welcome to Dr. Joe Unplugged. The topics discussed in this podcast will reflect my opinions and are not in any way to be regarded as medical advice. Accountability and big public health. A little bit of a contradiction in terms, I'm very, very sad to say. The story out of America, and as usual, we'll put the link in the description. Medical journals get letters from DOJ, which is the Department of Justice. At least 3 journals received letters from the US Attorney asking about competing viewpoints. Quote, a federal prosecutor sent letter to medical journal editor probing whether the publication is partisan when it comes to various scientific debates. Edward R. Martin Jr., US Attorney for the District of Columbia, sent a list of questions to CHEST Editor-in-Chief Peter Mazzoni of the Cleveland Clinic, asking how the journal handles, in inverted commas, misinformation and competing viewpoints, amongst other things. MedPage Today, who's got the story, has learned that at least 2 other journals have received similar letters. And it asks a number of questions about different viewpoints. Not surprisingly, all the public health and academia are up in arms. How dare the government question us? And to be fair, it's not the government's role to police thought or speech. But that is something that the governments have specialised in. So is there an issue with bias in medical journals? Well, interestingly, a paper put out by John Ioannidis looked at COVID-19 advocacy bias in the British Medical Journal, or the BMJ, and concluded that the BMJ has a strong bias in favour of authors advocating an aggressive approach to COVID-19 mitigation. So we're talking masks and lockdowns and, 1.5 metres or 6 feet apart. And if we look at the actual study itself, and I'll read the objectives. During the COVID-19 pandemic, BMJ, a leading journal on evidence-based medicine worldwide, published many views by advocates of specific COVID-19 policies. We aim to evaluate the presence and potential bias of the advocacy. So they looked at 122 authors were published. They looked at different approaches and what was recommended. Conclusions. BMJ has a strong bias in favour of authors advocating an aggressive approach. Advocacy bias may influence public opinion and policy decisions and should be mitigated in future health crises in favour of open and balanced debate of different policy opinions. What's really, I suppose, immediately sad and sort of startling is that in 2025 there needs to be recommendations for open and balanced debate of different policy options. But we know what happened, and we know that very often only one view is presented. And worse than that, in terms of bias in medical journals, there's also the issue of non-publication. So it's not only that a whole lot get published with one view, it's what doesn't get published. And there's a step before that, which is what gets funded. So, for example, in Australia, if you wanted to do a study on the benefits of vaping as a stop smoking mechanism, you'd never get money to do it from any research body that funds research because it goes against the narrative. And interestingly, I saw a piece the other day on how to maximise your chances of getting a grant for looking at the impacts of healthcare on climate change, which, by the way, and I didn't know this, healthcare apparently contributes more carbon emissions by a factor of 2 to 3-fold than total global aviation. So, keep in mind, you can't have a steak or go on a nice holiday, but the people who bleat about the world ending can, pretty much do whatever they like. Maybe not surprisingly, they're not going to support or fund studies that question that point of view. So there is a major and real problem with this. And we know that opinions were shut down. Jay Bhattacharya, who's now the head of the NIH and put out with his partners the Great Barrington Declaration, essentially proposed what had been done for many, or probably decades, if not more, maybe hundreds of years, even without people quantifying it as such, which is focused protection. And we also know that anybody in 2020 who questioned the idea that COVID didn't come from a bat but actually came from a lab was shut down. Now, maybe if it had turned out it had come from a bat, well, and the people who said it didn't were wrong, but they should have been entitled to be wrong. But in actual fact, that was not the case, and we know who was wrong. But what's even worse than that, it's not that those who said it didn't come from a lab were wrong. They knew it did, and they covered it up. And that is unacceptable. And we also know that the NIH under Anthony Fauci sent money to EcoHealth Alliance, headed by Peter Daszak, who in turn sent money to the Wuhan lab, because Barack Obama, as president, had banned gain-of-function research funding. So the White House has updated its COVID page, and I'll quote, "The proximal origins of COVID was used repeatedly by public health officials and the media to discredit the lab leak theory, was promoted by Dr. Fauci to push the preferred narrative." Well, not only did he push the preferred narrative, he effectively shut down anybody who didn't, and people were castigated and banned from social media, and also shadow banned and sometimes prosecuted. And people lost their medical license for asking simple questions. Look, I won't read everything here, but it's very, very interesting. The Department of Justice has opened an investigation into EcoHealth's pandemic-era activities, as it should do. A lab-related incident involving gain-of-function research is the most likely origin of COVID-19. NIH's procedures for funding and overseeing potentially dangerous research are deficient, unreliable, and pose a serious threat to both public health and national security. Why on earth would anybody be making viruses more infective? And the answer is, oh, well, if they're more infectious, that'll help us develop a vaccine. Well, maybe if you didn't make them more infectious in the first place, you wouldn't need to develop a vaccine against what you have created. Hello. So, look, those people who don't like Donald Trump will, of course, see it through that prism, but this is not about Donald Trump. This is actually about real and genuine science and actual facts and eliminating bias as much as one can. Everybody's got their own opinion. Everybody's entitled to their own opinion, and they should be entitled to express it. Meanwhile, closer to home in Victoria, it's also come out that the lockdowns and curfew in Victoria were not based on health advice at all. So the mechanism was not that the Chief Health Officer and his associates recommended curfew from 9 p.m. because, of course, after 9 p.m. that's when the virus comes out to play, and before that we're all good, and obviously lockdowns, restrictions of movement. But it actually came from the Premier's office and was then sent for, if you like, support and verification from the public health powers that be, Brett Sutton and his offsiders. So essentially, it was not a health decision, it was a political decision which then got backing from watch my tongue here, people working in public health, and obviously the senior people. It's taken, and the Victorian government fought tooth and nail against a freedom of information application to have these emails released. Whatever happened to open and transparent government? And I know it's a rhetorical question. But that they fought tooth and nail to keep this document out clearly tells you that they had something to hide. And other states in Australia, including WA, it would be interesting to have FOI requests to see also which direction did the recommendations go. Were the recommendations cooked up in the Premier's office and then sent to the health officers for rubber stamping, or did they actually come from the health officers and then go to the Premier's office. And I don't know, but I've got suspicions, and I suspect a lot of other people have. And all of those suspicions could be put to rest if all the relevant emails and information were made public. If you go to a doctor, you have by law a right to access your medical file. So any information contained in that, you are under freedom of information allowed to access. It's the advice you were given. When advice is given to the whole population, you're not allowed to get access to that advice. Seems like a bit of a double standard to me. But, maybe that's just me. So I know a lot of people do want to move on from the pandemic response, and I'll put my hand up and say I'm included in that. But, after World War II, we also needed to move on, but we needed to learn the lessons. And after major events, we need to learn lessons, and so much was done wrong. But what's becoming apparent is not even this argument that, mistakes were made, we didn't know. Very, very different to make honest mistakes. Everybody who does anything is going to make mistakes. It's inevitable. But if you actually know what you're doing and you take certain actions, and it wasn't a mistake, it was deliberate, and you knew that what you were doing was wrong, that's very, very different. And these people need to be held accountable. Thanks for listening to Dr. Joe Unplugged. If you enjoyed this podcast, please like, share, and consider subscribing. Tell your friends. If there are topics you'd like to see covered, be in touch through the chat or email info@drjoe.net.au. We'll be uploading new content each Monday, and soon we'll be putting these videos out on X. You can follow me there at Dr. Joe's DIY Health.